He had always loved his backyard. It was quiet, peaceful, and just big enough to enjoy small projects. After years of dreaming, he finally decided to build a small shed at the back of the property. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure painted a soft shade of gray, but it meant a lot to him. He wanted a place to store tools, keep his garden equipment, and have a little space for his hobbies. The shed took a few weekends to build, but he enjoyed every minute. Hammering the nails, measuring the wood, and watching the structure come together gave him a sense of satisfaction. When it was done, he stood back and admired it. It fit perfectly in the corner of the yard, almost blending into the surroundings. He even added a small window and a flower box underneath it. His neighbors sometimes walked by and gave a nod of approval, and that made him smile. Life went on peacefully. Most days he would spend time tinkering in the shed, fixing old tools, or starting small craft projects. The shed became his personal retreat. It was a simple pleasure, but it brought him joy. He didn't make noise, he didn't disturb anyone, and he took care to keep it neat and clean. For a long time, he felt like he had found a little piece of happiness in his busy life. One morning, while sipping coffee on his porch, he noticed an official-looking envelope in the mailbox. The paper inside was crisp and formal. He opened it and frowned as he read the words. It was a notice from the Homeowners Association, the HOA that governed his neighborhood. According to the letter, his shed was in violation of the community rules. It was apparently too big, too visible, or in some other way, non-compliant. The letter demanded that he remove the shed or face fines and other consequences. He reread the letter several times, trying to make sense of it. Too big, too visible? The shed was modest, barely noticeable from the street. He had followed the neighborhood guidelines as best as he could. It felt unfair, almost absurd. But the letter was clear. Take down the shed or face trouble. At first he felt a wave of anger. How could they tell him what he could do on his own property? He had built the shed for himself, for his own enjoyment, without harming anyone. It was a small thing, yet it had brought him so much satisfaction. The thought of losing it made him feel both frustrated and helpless. He tried to calm down and think rationally. The next day he went to the HOA office, hoping to speak with someone and resolve the matter peacefully. He wanted to explain that the shed was simple, neat, and posed no problem to anyone. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. When he arrived, he was met with polite but firm staff, who repeated that the shed violated the rules and that the decision was final. There was little room for discussion. He left feeling disappointed but determined to fight for what he thought was fair. Back home, he began researching. He read the HOA's rules and regulations, checking every line that could possibly relate to his shed. He also looked into local property laws, learning about homeowners' rights and how they could sometimes override HOA rules. He was careful to note details to understand exactly where he stood legally. He spent hours reading forums and talking to neighbors. Some were sympathetic, offering advice and encouragement. Others warned that the HOA had influence and could be difficult to deal with. He tried writing letters to the HOA, explaining his case calmly and clearly. He highlighted that the shed was small, well-maintained, and brought no harm or inconvenience to the community. He asked for reconsideration, for a compromise, perhaps some adjustment to make the shed acceptable. But the replies were brief and unyielding. The HOA insisted the shed must go. It became clear that they weren't interested in dialogue or understanding. Rules were rules, and they would enforce them strictly. Each letter from the HOA made him feel more frustrated. What started as a small, peaceful enjoyment of his property had turned into a source of tension and stress. He couldn't believe that something so minor had escalated so quickly. He felt as if he were caught in a system that didn't care about fairness or common sense. Every day he walked past the shed, now seeing it as a symbol of a larger struggle. It was his small victory over ordinary life, now threatened by bureaucracy. Despite the stress, he refused to give up. He began speaking to neighbors, quietly asking for advice and sharing his experience. Some were shocked, unable to understand how the HOA could act this way. Others shared similar stories of minor disputes blown out of proportion. Listening to them, he realized he wasn't alone. Many people had felt the sting of strict HOA enforcement, but few had stood up against it. He wanted to be the one who did. He also started documenting everything carefully. Photographs of the shed, dates of correspondence, and notes about conversations with HOA representatives. He knew that if this went further, having a clear record would be important. He began to see the situation as a challenge, not just a fight over a shed. It became about standing up for his rights and refusing to be bullied by rules that didn't make sense. One evening, after another frustrating email from the HOA, he sat on the porch and stared at his shed. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the yard. The shed looked peaceful, almost innocent, standing quietly as it had always done. He realized how much it meant to him, not just as a storage space, but as a place where he could be himself. The idea of losing it seemed unbearable. He started thinking creatively. There had to be a way to protect the shed without resorting to endless arguments. Maybe there were legal loopholes or ways to negotiate from a position of strength. The thought of finding a clever solution sparked a determination in him. He wouldn't let this small structure, so full of personal meaning, be taken away without a fight. The shed had become more than wood and nails. It was a symbol of his autonomy, his right to enjoy his home. As the night grew darker, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Frustration, yes, but also resolve. He wasn't going to let a notice from the HOA decide the fate of his backyard dreams. He would explore every possible option, learn every law, and use every tool at his disposal. The small shed had become a cause worth fighting for. And in that quiet moment under the fading light, he knew this was only the beginning of a story that would test his patience, creativity, and courage in ways he hadn't imagined. He decided that ignoring the HOA was not an option. The letters had made it clear that they were serious. Their rules were strict and their enforcement was even stricter. Still, giving up the shed was not something he could consider. It had taken so much effort to build, and it had become a place of peace for him. He wanted to find a way to protect it without losing his calm or sanity. The first step was to gather information. He spent evenings poring over the HOA rules, studying every clause that could apply to his shed. He read through pages of community guidelines in fine print, marking sections that seemed relevant. It was tedious work, but he understood that knowledge was power. He also looked into local property laws, trying to understand where his rights began and the HOA's authority ended. He discovered that some rules could be challenged if they were unreasonable or violated broader property rights. This gave him a glimmer of hope. While researching, he reached out to friends and neighbors. Some had been through similar battles with the HOA, and their experiences were eye-opening. One neighbor described how a small flower garden had been deemed unsightly, and the HOA had demanded its removal. Another told him about a porch that had been painted the wrong color and how the owner had fought back. Listening to their stories, he realized that many people felt powerless in front of the HOA, but that didn't mean it was impossible to fight back. He also joined online forums where homeowners shared their experiences with restrictive associations. He read stories of people who had won disputes, often by carefully documenting everything and understanding their legal options. The community offered advice, encouragement, and even strategies for negotiating with the HOA. He felt less alone. It was comforting to know that others had faced similar frustrations and had found ways to protect what mattered to them. Armed with knowledge and advice, he decided to respond to the HOA formally. He wrote letters explaining his case in a calm and reasoned way. He detailed why the shed posed no harm, emphasizing its modest size and careful maintenance. He included photos showing the shed from different angles, demonstrating that it did not block anyone's view or violate the spirit of the community rules. He proposed compromises, such as adding landscaping to obscure it slightly or adjusting certain features if necessary. He hoped that reason and documentation would help. The HOA replied, but their response was not encouraging. They acknowledged his letter but insisted that the shed was in violation and had to be removed. The tone was polite but firm. There was no room for discussion. Each letter he received seemed to make the problem bigger rather than smaller. The fines and threats hung over him like a shadow. It was frustrating, but it also made him more determined. He realized that patience and careful planning would be essential if he wanted to protect his shed. He began documenting everything carefully. Every email, letter, and conversation was recorded. He even took notes during phone calls, noting the date, time, and what had been said. He understood that this record could be crucial if the situation escalated to legal proceedings. It also gave him a sense of control. When the HOA acted on, he also looked for support from neighbors. Some had been sympathetic from the beginning, quietly expressing frustration about the HOA's strictness. They offered advice, but more importantly, they offered encouragement. One neighbor suggested attending the HOA meetings, even if it was just to listen. Another suggested speaking with a lawyer for a consultation. These small gestures reinforced that he was not alone in feeling the unfairness of the situation. Attending an HOA meeting was an eye-opening experience. The atmosphere was tense, and the board members seemed confident in their authority. They discussed various minor violations with strict enforcement, from lawn care issues to fence height regulations. When his case was brought up, the discussion was brief. They reiterated that the shed did not comply with the rules and that he had to remove it. He tried to speak, to explain the personal importance of the shed, but the board was largely uninterested in his perspective. It was clear that arguing face-to-face would not be enough. After the meeting, he returned home and took a long walk around the neighborhood. The quiet streets, the neatly trimmed lawns, and the uniform houses contrasted sharply with the tension he felt. The shed, standing peacefully at the back of his yard, seemed to mock the rigidity of the rules. It was just a simple structure, yet it had become the center of conflict. He realized that this wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about standing up for personal freedom and resisting unnecessary control. He began to consider creative solutions. If the HOA would not budge, maybe there was a way to protect the shed through legal or strategic means. He explored options for variances, permits, and legal exemptions. He even thought about ways to gain influence over the HOA indirectly. The idea of using knowledge, strategy, and careful planning began to take shape in his mind. It was no longer just a shed. It was a challenge that required intelligence and patience to overcome. During this period, he also found ways to cope with stress. Gardening, cooking, and spending time in the shed itself helped him maintain balance. The process of standing up for himself was exhausting, but the shed remained a sanctuary where he could focus on simple pleasures. This balance was essential. He knew that if he let frustration take over, he might make mistakes or act rashly. As the days passed, he felt a quiet determination growing within him. The letters and threats from the HOA were frustrating, but they also made him more resolute. He would not give up his shed without a fight. He would explore every avenue, learn every rule, and use every resource at his disposal. The shed had become a symbol of persistence, of protecting what mattered, and of standing firm in the face of unnecessary obstacles. He looked at the shed one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The warm glow of light filtered through the small window, casting gentle shadows inside. The shed had been built with care, and it had become a place of peace and creativity. The thought of losing it was unbearable, but now he felt ready to challenge the unfair rules, ready to think strategically, and ready to find a way to keep the shed and his freedom intact. The battle was far from over, but he was no longer afraid. He had a plan forming, a determination solidifying, and a quiet confidence that he could face the challenges ahead. The weeks that followed were filled with planning and quiet determination. The protagonist spent evenings at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, notes, and photographs of the shed. Each document was carefully organized. Every letter from the HOA, every email, every response, and every rule excerpt was cataloged. It felt like assembling pieces of a puzzle, but instead of a picture, the goal was strategy and understanding. He realized that the issue was bigger than just the shed. The HOA's strict enforcement of rules showed that they valued authority over fairness. It became clear that winning a small argument with them would not solve the problem. The rules themselves gave them power to control lives. If he wanted real protection for his shed and his property, he would need a plan that addressed the system, not just a single dispute. Late one night, he began imagining different ways to shift the balance. He thought about legal options, about variances and permits, and about speaking to a lawyer for guidance. But even more than that, he started considering how the HOA operated. He knew they had a local office, a hub for managing the neighborhood, keeping records and handling violations. He had driven past it many times, never thinking much about it. Now he wondered if the office itself could be a key to gaining leverage. Curiosity turned into research. He dug into property records, public filings, and ownership documents. He discovered that the office was privately owned, not a public building. That meant it could be bought legally like any other property. If he could somehow acquire it, he could influence the HOA indirectly. The thought was bold, almost audacious, but it excited him. Instead of simply fighting within the rules, he could change the rules' context altogether. He spent the next days planning cautiously. Buying the office would not be simple, and he needed to be precise. He researched local real estate processes, prepared questions, and even started thinking about finances. It would take patience and careful negotiation. Still, the idea of turning the situation around filled him with energy. He could feel the possibilities opening up, like a new chapter of the story waiting to be written. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their routine enforcement. Notices were sent, fines were threatened, and the sense of pressure remained constant. But he no longer felt powerless. With every letter, he grew more skilled in understanding the rules, more clever in finding ways to protect himself, and more determined to act strategically. The shed had become more than a personal space. It had become a symbol of resilience and problem-solving. He started reaching out to experts quietly. Real estate agents, property lawyers, and local advisors provided insights into how the purchase of the office could be arranged. Some warned that the HOA might resist, but that only strengthened his resolve. Each conversation was a step forward, giving him information and confidence. He realized that knowledge, preparation, and patience were his greatest allies. As he plotted, he also kept life as normal as possible. Friends visited, neighbors waved, and he maintained his routines. The shed remained a sanctuary, a place to decompress and stay grounded. He spent hours tinkering, building small projects, and simply enjoying the space. This balance kept him sharp and calm, ensuring that his focus remained on the long-term goal rather than short-term frustration. One afternoon, he took a careful drive past the HOA office, studying its layout, entrances, and surroundings. He imagined how negotiations could happen, what kind of approach would be effective, and how to maintain professionalism. It was part planning, part visualization, and part strategy. He realized that courage would need to be paired with patience, and bold ideas would need careful execution. He also reflected on the moral aspect of his plan. Buying the office was not about revenge. It was about fairness, about ensuring that he and others could enjoy their property without arbitrary interference. This perspective kept him focused and grounded. He wanted to challenge the rules but not to harm anyone. The idea of balancing assertiveness with fairness became a guiding principle in his strategy. Evenings were often spent walking the neighborhood. He observed the homes, the gardens, the people, and their routines. It reinforced his understanding that the HOA's strictness sometimes disrupted ordinary lives unnecessarily. The contrast between the peace he experienced in his backyard and the control exerted by the HOA fueled his determination. The shed, quiet and sturdy, symbolized independence and personal freedom. Finally, after weeks of careful study and planning, he began taking concrete steps. He contacted the current owner of the HOA office, asking questions about the property, its history, and its potential availability. The responses were formal but polite. Negotiations would take time, but they had begun. He felt a thrill of progress. For the first time, the abstract idea of changing the rules became real, tangible, and achievable. He continued preparing in parallel. He reviewed his documentation, refined his letters, and ensured that every step was legal and above board. Each detail mattered. Precision and planning were essential. He learned to anticipate possible objections, prepare responses, and maintain a calm, professional approach. Every small preparation gave him confidence and strengthened his sense of agency. Throughout this process, the shed remained central to his thoughts. He maintained it carefully, adding small improvements and using it as a space to refine his strategy. It was both a retreat and a laboratory, where he could think freely and plan intelligently. The more he worked, the more he realized how much the shed had grown beyond its original purpose. It had become a symbol of resilience, creativity, and determination. By the end of Part 3, the protagonist was no longer reacting to the HOA's actions. He had moved from frustration to strategy, from passive resistance to proactive planning. The idea of buying the office had transformed from a daring thought into a real possibility. He was ready to take bold legal steps to protect his shed and his freedom. He understood the challenges ahead, but he also recognized his growing ability to overcome them. The stage was set for a turning point, and the story of the shed was about to enter a new decisive chapter. Negotiations for the HOA office were not quick, but the protagonist remained patient. Each meeting, call, and email was carefully considered. He approached the discussions professionally, asking questions about the property, understanding the terms, and reviewing legal documents. It became clear that acquiring the office was possible, but it required careful planning and persistence. Every step needed to be above board, precise, and deliberate. Finally, after weeks of communication, the owner agreed to a fair deal. It was a quiet, ordinary transaction in many ways, but for the protagonist it felt monumental. Owning the office meant more than property. It meant influence, a legal safeguard, and a shift in the balance of power. He felt a sense of quiet triumph, knowing that this strategic move could finally protect his shed and set a precedent for fairness. As the transfer of ownership was finalized, he began to see the implications. The HOA could no longer threaten his shed without risking conflict with the property owner. He was now in a position where he could engage with the HOA from a point of strength. He understood the importance of remaining calm, professional, and fair. This was not a victory to gloat over, but a responsibility to use wisely. He spent days reviewing the details of the office ownership, ensuring that all legal requirements were met. Every document was checked, every signature verified, and every regulation observed. It was meticulous work, but he knew that any oversight could undermine the achievement. The care he put into the process reflected his broader approach: methodical, patient, and strategic. The shed, which had been the center of frustration and tension for so long, suddenly felt safe. He could walk past it without a sense of dread, enjoying the simple pleasure it offered. The small wooden structure, once threatened by bureaucracy, now stood as a symbol of persistence, intelligence, and careful planning. Every nail, every plank, and every coat of paint seemed to radiate significance beyond its material form. Neighbors began to notice the change. Some were curious about the new development, asking questions about the office and his interactions with the HOA. Others watched quietly, perhaps impressed by his patience and ingenuity. The protagonist maintained a calm demeanor, sharing what was appropriate but keeping the focus on fairness and responsibility rather than conflict or boasting. He also started attending HOA meetings in his new capacity as a property owner. The atmosphere was familiar yet different. This time he had influence and standing. He listened carefully, observed the discussions, and contributed where appropriate. The HOA members, initially unaware of the shift, began to realize that his position had changed. Rules could no longer be enforced without consideration, and the tone of meetings subtly shifted. Despite the victory, he remained cautious. He knew that influence had to be exercised responsibly, and that fairness and ethics were paramount. His goal was not to dominate or retaliate, but to ensure that reasonable decisions were made. The shed had been the spark, but the larger lesson was about integrity, patience, and strategic thinking. He had learned that influence carried responsibility, and he approached it with humility. He continued improving the shed and the backyard. Small touches, a new shelf, better lighting, a coat of protective varnish enhanced its utility and charm. Friends and neighbors occasionally visited, admiring the shed and sharing stories. It had become more than a structure. It was a space for connection, creativity, and personal enjoyment. The conflict with the HOA had transformed it into a symbol of persistence, planning, and the power of careful action. Over time, the relationship with the HOA evolved. Their tone became more measured, more professional, and less rigid. The presence of the new office owner influenced discussions and decisions, encouraging fairness over arbitrary enforcement. Rules were still enforced where appropriate, but there was more room for understanding and dialogue. He had not only protected his shed but had contributed to a small shift in how the HOA operated, benefiting the entire community. Evenings in the backyard became moments of reflection. He would sit on a small chair near the shed, sipping tea or coffee, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The journey from frustration to victory replayed in his mind, and he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The shed had survived, and in doing so had taught him lessons about resilience, patience, and creative problem-solving. He also considered the broader implications. The story of the shed, the conflict, and the office purchase became an example to others in the neighborhood. It demonstrated that careful planning, patience, and a focus on fairness could overcome seemingly rigid authority. Friends shared the story quietly, Not as gossip, but as inspiration. The protagonist understood that true influence came not from force, but from knowledge, strategy, and ethical action. Through it all, the shed remained central. It was a quiet victory, a personal sanctuary, and a symbol of independence. Every day he walked past it with a sense of calm and pride. The wooden structure, once threatened by strict rules, now represented the power of careful planning, persistence, and moral courage. It stood as a testament to what one could achieve when intelligence, patience, and determination were applied thoughtfully. By the end of this chapter, the protagonist had achieved more than he had initially imagined. The shed was safe, the office was under his ownership, and the HOA had been gently reminded of fairness. He had navigated a complex situation with skill and integrity, and the quiet victory felt deeply satisfying. It was a reminder that ordinary people could face challenges, use their wits, and achieve meaningful results without resorting to conflict or aggression. As he closed the day, sitting near the shed with the evening breeze on his face, he realized that the journey had been transformative. The conflict had tested his patience, creativity, and resolve. It had taught him to think strategically, act ethically, and persevere in the face of frustration. The shed, quiet and sturdy, now stood not only as a personal space but as a symbol of resilience, intelligence, and thoughtful action. With the HOA office now under his ownership, life took on a new sense of calm. The shed that had once been the source of stress and anxiety now stood as a symbol of persistence and careful strategy. Each time he walked past it, he felt a quiet satisfaction. What had started as a small personal project had grown into a story of patience, intelligence, and determination. The HOA, aware of the change, began treating him differently. Meetings that once felt tense and confrontational now had a more balanced tone. Board members were still in charge, but they were more measured in their approach. They realized that arbitrary enforcement could no longer be taken lightly. The protagonist engaged in discussions when necessary, offering his perspective calmly and fairly. The balance had shifted, and with it came a sense of respect and understanding. Neighbors noticed the change too. Some approached him quietly, curious about how he had managed to resolve such a long-standing dispute. Others simply observed, taking note of the fairness that now guided the HOA's actions. He shared his story carefully, emphasizing the importance of patience, strategy, and standing up for one's rights responsibly. It became clear that his actions had a ripple effect, inspiring others to approach conflicts thoughtfully rather than with fear or resignation. The shed continued to serve its original purpose, but it now carried deeper significance. It was a place for hobbies, reflection, and relaxation, but it was also a reminder of what could be achieved with intelligence and perseverance. Small improvements were added over time: better shelves, improved lighting, and protective varnish to withstand the weather. Each addition enhanced the functionality and charm of the space, reinforcing the sense that it was a personal sanctuary worth protecting. Life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy, but the lessons of the struggle remained vivid. He reflected often on the journey, realizing that frustration had been a teacher. It had encouraged him to research, plan, and think creatively. It had pushed him to engage with the community and understand the importance of ethics and fairness. He understood that the shed was never just about storage. It was about standing up for oneself with intelligence, patience, and integrity. Friends continued to visit, admiring the shed and the thoughtful planning that had gone into every aspect. Conversations often touched on the story of the dispute, the office acquisition, and the shift in the HOA's approach. The protagonist shared insights without pride, emphasizing practical lessons. Document everything, understand the rules, remain calm, and think strategically. His story became a quiet source of inspiration for those facing similar challenges. Evenings were spent quietly in the backyard, enjoying the peace that had once seemed threatened. He would sit near the shed, watching the sun filter through the trees, listening to the wind, and enjoying the gentle sounds of the neighborhood. The experience had taught him to value patience, careful planning, and the power of steady, thoughtful action. The shed had become a place of learning and reflection as much as a practical space. The HOA's approach to other homeowners gradually shifted as well. Seeing the protagonist's fair and strategic handling of the situation influenced how they treated future cases. Rules were still enforced, but there was a greater willingness to listen, understand, and compromise where appropriate. The community benefited from this change, and he felt a quiet sense of pride in having contributed to a fairer, more reasonable environment. As time passed, the shed became more than a personal space. It became a symbol in the neighborhood. People saw it as a testament to persistence, intelligence, and ethical action. It inspired conversations about how to handle disputes, the importance of understanding rules, and the value of standing up for what matters. It reminded everyone that ordinary people could face challenges and succeed through careful planning and thoughtful action. He also reflected on his own growth throughout the process. The conflict had tested his patience, creativity, and resilience. It had taught him to navigate complex situations without losing integrity. He had learned that power did not always come from confrontation. It often came from preparation, knowledge, and a calm, strategic approach. The shed, quiet and sturdy, became a symbol of that personal growth. One sunny afternoon, he hosted a small gathering in the backyard. Neighbors came to see the shed, enjoy the space, and share in the calm atmosphere. Laughter and conversation filled the air. People admired the craftsmanship, the care, and the thoughtfulness that had gone into the shed and the surrounding garden. The protagonist felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had once been a source of stress had become a place of community, connection, and shared appreciation. Reflecting on the journey, he realized that the shed had taught him more than any lesson he could have anticipated. It had been a spark that led to growth, strategy, and understanding. He had faced bureaucracy, navigated rules, and found a way to protect what mattered through intelligence and careful action. The victory was quiet but meaningful, a testament to resilience and thoughtful planning. The sun set over the backyard, casting a warm glow across the shed and garden. He sat quietly enjoying the moment, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. The struggle with the HOA had ended, the shed was safe, and a lesson had been learned: persistence, preparation, and fairness could overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable. In the end, the shed remained a simple wooden structure, but it carried a profound significance. It was a symbol of independence, a space for creativity and peace, and a reminder that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results through thoughtfulness and perseverance. The protagonist understood that while the conflict had been challenging, it had led to growth, learning, and a lasting sense of satisfaction. He smiled as he looked at the shed, knowing that it had survived not just because of nails and wood, but because of careful planning, persistence, and a commitment to fairness. It stood quietly in the backyard, a testament to resilience and thoughtful action, and a reminder that challenges could be overcome with patience, intelligence, and courage.